Good morning. My name is Stam, and this is Lindsey Wiggins. I'm the extension agent for the Seminole Tribe of Florida. I'm part of a USDA and NIFA program that puts extension agents out onto Indian reservations across the country. Lindsey is she's a multi-county specialized livestock agent, and she's smart. So I asked her long ago to help me to make sure that when I made mistakes, Lindsey could kind of point me in the right direction and keep me straight. So today we're going to talk just a little bit about a very unique situation that I stumbled into when I began with the tribe about 5 years ago, and that was smutgrass. I'm an Iowan by nature. I grew up in southeast Iowa, and I had never seen smutgrass before 5 years ago, so I kind of started with a fresh slate when it came to looking at this as an issue or an idea. That I didn't have a lot of preconceived notions, but I did understand that we were seeing some real issues. And at one cattle owners meeting, there's cattle owners meetings that I go to every month, and a man had asked me over and over for a while. He said, "What are we doing about smutgrass, Aaron? What are you doing about smutgrass?" And I kept saying, "Well, we recommend 1 quart per acre of Velpar." And he looked at me and he said, "You are lazy." And in my family, you could be called a lot of things, but if you got called the L word, it was on. And I turned 8 shades of red and proceeded to tell him how I wasn't lazy. And basically he said, "Well, then do something about this. Give me something besides what you've said, Aaron, because we've got 7,000 acres of smutgrass, and I'm surrounded by it, and you can't tell me anything other than what you're saying." And so I started to look, and just started at the very beginning, but we've made some progress over the time, and really think that for our situation, we might have come across something that will work well. So advance to the next slide. There we are. One of the things that I saw a lot of when I began was look just like that there were a whole bunch of big clumps of smutgrass, overgrazed Bahia all on the inside of it, and just non-utilized smutgrass. And as you all know, if you turn your cows out onto that, they can't do anything with it. And so in order to get to grazing smutgrass, not only are you going to have to make sure that you've exposed your cows to smutgrass in the right way, but you're going to have that smutgrass in a condition where it's palatable and can be eaten. And I'll talk about that in just a little bit. But we definitely know a few things when it comes to grazing smutgrass. It's probably not for everybody. You know, if everyone in this room said, "I'm going to hear you speak and Lindsey speak today, and we're going to go graze smutgrass," I know that's not the case. That grazing smutgrass is going to qualify for people in unique situations. And there is an economic threshold, and that threshold is where does it stop being a weed and start becoming a forage? And I can't make that decision for folks, whether that's 50% coverage in your pasture, 70% coverage in your pastures, or when you get to a scenario that I walked into where it was darn near 100%. And when I say 100%, you know that there were weeds in between the smutgrass clumps. There's dollarweed and match stem and things of that nature. But primarily the canopies of these pastures were completely covered with smutgrass. And so everybody's got to make that decision for their ranch. We can go through some numbers if anybody ever wants to sit down and decide what does that look like. But for so many of my ranchers for the Seminole tribe, they had been using it as a forage already. That economic threshold had been passed long ago, but then we needed to get some things established about once it becomes a forage, how are you going to manage it? What practices can you be put out there to manage it? And what are you going to get in return for what you're managing? So that's really what we began to look at. And Lindsey Wiggins, you interrupt me at any time when okay. And so one of the things that happened is during our tribal cattle shipping period, I was still a pretty new extension agent, and I was at the scale as animals were coming through, and I was looking at Alex Johns when a producer had calves coming through, and I said, "Man, these things are monsters. Like, these are big, fat calves." We noticed that on the Brighton Reservation that just some certain producers had some very good-looking calves. And then we got down to Big Cypress, and Keith Crum, who's sitting there, he's the Seminole Tribe cattle foreman for Big Cypress, and I'd been with him several times while I was still new, and I'd seen quite a few pastures, and Heath had shown me around. But we got to a gentleman's calves named Bush. They call him Bush, like the beer, Bush beer. Robert Cypress, and his calves came in, and they were noticeably bigger than a lot of folks. He might have had 20, 30 pounds on his next closest competitor average weaning weight. And as they came through, I hadn't been to Bush's pasture, but we started to say, there's something going on here. What's happened? And what Bush was doing is he was going out and he was getting on his tractor at night, and he had quite a few acres. I don't know exactly what he had divided into 2 large pastures, but he'd go out and he'd just mow strips. And he'd mow strips throughout the pastures, really with no preconceived notion of how much he was going to mow that day, how far he was going to mow, but just on a fairly regular basis, 2-3 times a week, Bush was out mowing strips in his smut grass to keep it down. Well, what we saw out there after we had seen that initial observation that he had fat calves, we just kind of went out there and I started looking over the fence. What's happening here? And we saw where he'd been mowing these strips. Cows and calves or the cows that were left at that point were selecting that new smut grass out there, that they were camping out in those areas where he had mowed. And we said, there's no question, there's probably some very good forage out there. And as Jose said, I kind of felt like as a new person coming in, I thought, oh my goodness, I have no idea what we can do about smut grass. So I broke it down into what can be done. And we knew that burning was one of the options. Mowing needs to be done at proper height and frequency. One of the things that we had looked at is we had lots of people that own mowers on their ranches, and some of them will set them high, put that tractor in 4th gear, and they're gone, right? They're mowing smut grass. Well, then we watched and we saw people that were putting that baby down in 1st gear, lowering the mower deck, and we're talking 7 inches or lower is where we could really see that they were getting into the tussocks, where there was being new growth, a lot of new growth coming out of that. And so we just started to pay attention to what differences were happening out on the ranch. So we knew mowing was one of the options. We also had seen Joe Walter. Somebody had talked about him before. He had done a study that I found very interesting that was on intensive grazing, mob grazing. I think when I looked at that, Jim Suter, the NRCS officer back there, he had a study, and the man who was there before him, I sat with Cliff Starling, and we looked at Joe Walter's study on that, and we said, well, this is pretty interesting and could be very applicable for some of our clientele. We also knew about herbicide applications. They've talked about that, and the use of rollers, choppers, aerators. We had ranchers utilizing that to reduce some of the smut grass. So the next thing we knew we had to do is somehow start to quantify what was happening with the smut grass, what it was, and what we were going to see. So we decided to do a nutritional value of smut grass study. And Lindsay, you can interrupt. I'll get out of the way.
Okay, so I just want to thank some people that are actually in this room. George Full with NRCS actually helped us with this study because he's also interested in grazing smut grass, or at least making use of the forage that's there instead of working against it. And he made sure that we had collection hoops and everything we needed to make this study happen. Down in our fertilizer, the cages that we use, which you'll see in just a second, it's just the bottom of your liquid fertilizer totes. So thank you for Diamond R giving us those cages from LaBelle. And the Seminole tribe donated 2 pastures for us to use. And the reason why we did it in 2 pastures is we had to duplicate that study, so there wasn't just one place where we were looking at data and it was replicated. Each one of our trials, or each one of our treatments was duplicated 8 times. So it was carried out in 2 separate locations on the Big Cypress. This is an example of how the pasture looked. There was basically 3 strips. We had the dry fertilizer man run just a strip, a row in that pasture, and then we had a control treatment where we did nothing to it at all, no fertilizer, no herbicide, nothing. And we also used a combination of liquid nitrogen and Grazing X to control the broadleaf weeds in one of our treatments. And also I think it should be noted that the pasture was completely burned, fire burned, before we started our trial. So the collections were on days 14 days after herbicide or fertilizer application, and 21 days, 28 days, and 42. The collection hoops that George let us use were almost 1 square foot, so within those cages that were, I'll show you a picture of them, that's the picture of the cage. They're about 4 foot by 4 foot, so we were able to just place those hoops in the center, on the corners of those cages and collect in that way. And the data that we got back from the forage that we did collect was the weight to determine the pounds per acre, so we knew what kind of yield we were getting off of that new growth and be able to compare it to some of the other forages that we know what kind of yield we're getting off of that. And then also we wanted to know what the crude protein and TDN, or total digestible nutrients, was in the forages that we were collecting. And something else I want to point out, Jose had mentioned in the studies that they did with the cages, those cages were moved after collections happened. These cages are stationary. They've been there since we started. So we completely controlled it with, and I'll show you, even we had to put chicken wire around it because rabbits and other things would get in there and eat some of the plants out of there and affect the nutritive value of what we were collecting. So we made sure that it was completely excluded from anything eating our samples. There was also composite residual samples every 21 days after we completed the 42-day sample, just to see how long the fertilizer stayed in that plant or in that ground, and the smutgrass was able to absorb it. We did take measurements of the forage, or of the smutgrass. I don't need to call it a forage because we usually call it a weed, but here I am calling smutgrass or forage now. So we did measure the height of the plant because we knew that we wanted to have some kind of management technique to come from what data we were collecting. And obviously we're not going to expect people to go out there and collect every 2 weeks, every 21 days, every 28 days. So we wanted there to be some visual characteristic that we could place on that plant so that you could determine maturity, and then also when the decline in nutrition happens. So we did measure that in there's a picture of the hoop here too, just so you can see how much we were collecting each time we did. That's a 21-day growth. You can see there's already seed head production there. And I think Jose said that some of the management practices, like burning or frequent mowing or frequent removal of that plant material, resulted in more seed production. So we saw seed production happen almost 10 days after we removed the plant material. And so Aaron is going to tell you how nutritive this new forage is.
So what I did here was we averaged the 14, 21, 28, and 42-day samples. And really what we saw on Mr. Cypress's pasture, on those samples, our crude protein was, again, what we came back to is very comparable of BAHIA. We had the liquid fertilizer and the Grazing X came in at just under 14% crude protein, TDN almost 55. Our dry, which would be a complete fertilizer, that was 50 pounds of nitrogen. It was a 20-0-10 fertilizer that was applied. We saw that crude protein shoot up. It was 14.5% crude protein with that TDN right around 57. And then the control, that's no fertilizer at all. And that came in at a crude protein of just under 12% and a TDN of 56. Again, that was something that we said it's a spring flush growth. We understand that the days of growth after we had come in, it's still pretty young smutgrass. So we knew that we had potential. Then on the Seminole Board of Directors, they gave us access to one of their pastures where it was duplicated. We saw that the crude protein of the liquid and Grazing X there really shot the crude protein up to 18%, again a TDN of 56. The dry, almost comparable at near 18%, a little higher TDN, and the control on that grass was over a 14% crude protein. And that was when we started saying, well, we knew there was something good about the forage value of smutgrass, but we weren't exactly sure what we were going to see. And we had numbers that range. Some of the 14-day samples that were real flush, they were as high as 23% crude protein, and when we would get those results back, I called Lindsey several times and said, I just can't believe the numbers I'm looking at. And sure enough, that came out to be true. But then towards the end of this, we just wanted to say, kind of for other interesting data, as we got talking about what was going to come from this, we looked at some of the weed crude protein and TDN values as we said, you know, what is it that we're killing out in those pastures? And just interesting data here. Non-fertilized thistle was about 15%. Non-fertilized match stem was 13.5%. Fertilized the cow itch vine, almost 17% crude protein with a super high TDN. And unfertilized ragweed blew me away when we saw over 25% crude protein in that and a TDN around 63. So with that, with the Seminole farms that were the ranches that we worked with, we had a small field day. We invited Alex Johns to come out, meet with me, his foreman Heath, and Lindsey, and a few of the ranchers that are out there. You can see in that field, that was one of the things that I think I had some folks from Mariana come down and saw some of the pastures, and I invited them to understand, you know, I think they thought I was crazy when I was saying I like smutgrass. But then when they could really see what we were talking about 7,000 acres of smutgrass, it really shows you that we have to look at other management techniques for some of these ranches. And so after we had all this data, we said, well, what do we do with it? You know, and I think I want to give Alex Johns a lot of credit, because I said, man, I would love to do a real grazing study on this. You know, Joe Walter had talked about mob grazing. I have seen his study. I think that would be a really cool thing to do. And Alex was like, figure it out, Aaron. Go do something. You know, don't just talk about it. So I came back and I said, man, I would love to do something. And I apologize. My computer hard drive crashed last night. I recreated some of these slides, and it's not exactly what I wanted, but this is a pretty good example of what I said. I would like to do something that I'm going to call competitive rotational grazing. And if you're ever on social media, I like to hashtag some of my reports, hashtag CRG. There's something else weird that's hashtag CRG, but if you see that, that's not me. But I'm on Facebook, and every once in a while I'll give some updates from where I'm doing competitive rotational grazing. And what I did, or what I proposed to Alex, is I said, let me build a paddock system, and I want 40 head of 2-year-old heifers to start with, to see what we could do. And really, what I started with was, I said, I just want to see what the smutgrass can support in the pasture. How do we give grazing recommendations to folks with smutgrass? So from that was born Pasture X. And really what Pasture X was going to be about was the efficient use of forage in a pasture. When I showed that first slide of smutgrass and all that brown dead smutgrass was out there, that's not efficient at all. And basically in any system, as you increase efficiency, you're going to increase production. I wanted to lower input costs. There was a lot that was going to go into Pasture X, but really what it came down to was going to be competitive rotational grazing, meaning more cattle on less land, less inputs, and we were going to push that smutgrass. All the things that made it a nasty weed, we wanted to see if we could use it to our advantage as a forage. And that was really what we wanted to look at with that. So we started out with 40 head. My 40 head, I think it's important to talk about where they came from, because they were 2-year-old heifers that had been at the Seminole tribe lease land from the Miccosukee tribe. It was all smutgrass. These girls had seen smutgrass from the day that they hit the ground. They knew what smutgrass was. It's all they had. They've eaten it. So they came from there. And we started out with 40 head. The days that I first saw these heifers, they'd been moved from the Miccosukee lease to a big cypress board pasture where we were doing a study. And when Heath and I and Lindsey pulled in the gate, they looked at us and they ran about 200 miles to the back pasture into the woods. And I said, man, I hate those cows right there. That makes me so crazy that they run, you know. And as time went on, I had no idea these were going to be the cows that I ended up getting stuck with. But eventually, Alex said, yeah, you're going to get those heifers that came from Miccosukee. And I thought it was a joke because I told him just how much I disliked those cows based on how waspy they were and being a little flighty. But so we started out with 40 head. The first time we worked them, there were a couple that, that just weren't worth much. One of them actually wandered off from the cow pens as we were moving them to pasturette, and she made it to a water hole and died. Another one was crippled, and she's one of my favorite cows now, but she's come through it. I took a section of 20 acres that is right in the middle of a huge heifer pasture for the Seminole tribe. It's where they develop their 2-year-old heifers. I took 20 acres in the middle of that, and I fenced off 4 5-acre paddocks. And what my theory was is that in order to use this smut grass efficiently, we really had to change the stocking rate. We had to flip it on its ear. On average, I can tell you that the tribe in Brighton, where I am, stocks 1 cow to every 2 3/4 acres. It's pretty standard. I said, Alex, I'm going to shoot for broke. If I start killing if the body condition score of these animals goes down, we'll knock some of the girls out of there. But let's start with 2 animals per acre. And he said, all right, that sounds like a good idea. So we moved forward. Each paddock, we had to do some labor to set this up. It didn't just come easy. There was not much water out there. Each paddock needed water. There was a first generation NRCS funded equipped solar well out there. I'm going to show you a picture of that in a little bit. That thing was basically a little bit above a hand pump. And so we were going to face some challenges with that. I also needed to make sure that each paddock had been mowed somewhat before those cows went in. There was a lot of dry, unutilized, dead biomass on top of those. So I wanted to make sure each one was mowed 21 days before the heifers were turned onto it. That kind of worked. It was a good idea, but it worked a little bit. Initially, I had to give those heifers all 20 acres. The day we brought them from the cow pens, they were crazy. We kept all the gates open and we let them run for about a week before there was one of my paddocks that has some woods on it, and we knew that that's where those cows were comfortable. After about a week, they're all in the woods one morning, and we came in and closed the gate, and I said, oh my goodness, we're going to be patching a lot of fence. And that was really what I was very, very concerned of, that these girls just hadn't been put into an area that small. At that point in time, I had an average body condition score of just under 4 on those cattle. And so they weren't in the shape we wanted, but we did want to see what we could do. We had made some assumptions, and we had to do some things that would follow the Seminole Tribe's heifer development plan. The first assumption, though, that we made is that the smut grass could come close to carrying nutritionally could carry the herd. We knew that based on the numbers we'd seen, we were going to be close. We had sugar lick was out all the time. That's part of the Seminole Tribe's mineral plan, as well as supplementation. So I had to agree with Alex that was just something that we were going to do. In Brighton, very often we will feed 2-year-old heifers, are given feed 60 days before the bulls go out, and then 30 days after the bulls go out, the feed still remains there. So there were 90 days of feed that these girls did get while just before the bulls went out. Our goal was to get them to a body condition score of near 5. We ended up surpassing that. I just wanted to share some of my numbers so people could see what had happened. Cost of feed was $221.76 per ton. It breaks it down by the pound. We had figured 10 pounds per head per day. We had some challenges with that. Our goal was 2 pounds a day per day, and that would put my cost of gain at 55 cents per pound of gain. My total feed cost right there for Mr. Walpole was $5,883. My sugar lick cost as of yesterday was $3,308, which made my feed and supplementation costs right up till yesterday just over $9,000, which tells me I carried them since late July, early August I carried them for about $229.79 in feed and supplement costs per head. And I think that was fairly good. The first thing I understood about feeding these girls is if you aren't minding it carefully, you will go broke on feed fast. And I called Jay Walpole one morning, and I hope he doesn't mind me sharing this. I said, Jay, you said that we were going to limit these at 10 pounds per feed per day, and they're eating 18. And he said, well, where are your slides on your doors on your feeder? I said, I'm not sure. And he said, well, go back, Aaron. And he said, I'll bet you they're wide open. And he was right. They were all wide open. And I followed his advice. I took that self-feeder. I took them down to about halfway, put a couple screws on each side of them so that they couldn't get in there and throw their head around. And it made a difference not only for the feed that was on the ground, but we started to see our consumption was just what he had promised me it would be, that we got real close to 10 pounds of consumption a day. And it just took a little while, but I know that if you're feeding and you're not monitoring that, you can get yourself upside down on heifers very quickly. So you can see that in that pasture that they couldn't, 40 head on 20 acres could not keep up with the smut grass for a long time. The smut grass would outpace what they could eat. And so we had lots of areas where we were calling it, they were self-selecting, they were grazing, but we were moving them every 7 days. And just again, to talk about the competitive rotational grazing, they're going to be stocked at a higher density, more efficiently graze available forage, more cows on less acres. Cows are less selective in a competitive rotational grazing system. And there's a lot of research out there that just says cows will eat weeds that they may not want to when they're put into a situation where they see the cow beside them has got her head down and she's eating. They respond. They're a social animal. They begin to, by analogy, it's like a fat kid at a Golden Corral. If you give him all day in there to cherry pick what he wants, he's probably going to eat ice cream and a few other things at his leisure. If you give him 10 minutes to get the food, all the food he can get, he's going to put his head down and eat. And that's what we're seeing in this system, is that these girls are like a fat kid at Golden Corral. They're eating everything that's out in front of them. Weeds are consumed at a much greater rate. I'll talk, many of the weeds are nutritious. We shared a little bit about that, but they're not the first choice. This picture, my other feed cost that was associated in there, I bought 1 ton of gator feed cubes, field cubes, to gentle those cows down. And after I shut them down in the first paddock, Brent told me yesterday, he said he liked that picture, I looked so happy. Well, the lady that took that picture, I'm still at the point of thinking those cows are about to hook me down. So I think I was laughing, saying, I'm dropping feed cubes, and I can hear them coming behind me. And I'm just wanting to make sure I can get back to my truck before I get run over. But what I did for the first day I drove out there, they all ran to the back of the paddock. I didn't even go in the pasture. I dumped a bag of cubes. I hollered at them, honked my horn, said, come on, girls, let's go. They wouldn't come out. I drove off. And for the next week, that's what I do. Every day I drive out, I dump a bag of cubes in there. By the end of the first week, I moved to the next paddock. I thought, oh, they're going to bust up fence. I pulled in there. I put a few pellets on the ground at my gate and poured the rest into the next paddock, drove on through, and within 10 minutes, I had all of them into paddock number 2. So I have gentled those animals down quite a bit. Some of our challenges were our hurricane. We had some fence damage, nothing that anybody else hasn't seen. Specific to the competitive rotational grazing system challenges, fly load and manure. We know we've got 40 head on, at any given time, 5 acres. I have seen more flies on that than what would be customary for the heifers that surround my pasture. So we've taken some steps to mitigate that. I talked a little bit about my water pump. There wasn't water out there. We have to be very conscientious that they never ran out of water. And then my paddocks 3 and 4, they're wide open Smutgrass Fields. I had no shade in those, and so I've utilized one shade structure. It's got a 10 by 20 tarp on it, and that's the only shade. Each time I go into paddock 3 and 4, I hook a chain on it and pull it in. And so my hope is that if I have the right kind of cows in that pasture, they can handle the heat, and they really did. There's my first generation water pump that was supplying all the water needs for my herd. It meant as we got started on this project, I would come out, and on a lot of days, I would see my tub look like that. It was gone. There wasn't water in it. And I'd have to go back, and there's a little check valve right there. And I'd have to pump it up and down, try and get water primed into that pump. And then that pump would start, and you'd hear the brushes on the motor. And I just pray, please, Lord, let this fill up that 500-gallon tank so they can drink. I'm still thinking I'm going to kill Alex Grahn's cattle, you know. And so eventually what we had to do is say that this research couldn't be compromised by a pump. So we invested in a new pump. I ended up, you can just see that one of the skis that my metal framework for my shade structure is on. It's right there. There's a shade cloth. I ended up buying 2 back scratchers to mitigate my fly load. That I use Corral and other fly products. I've got a 4-gallon reservoir in that. There's yarn that hangs down there. And it's taken the cows just a little while to get used to them, but they have absolutely responded very well to those. And so I didn't include that in my cost, but I'm just thinking of the mistakes I've made. I probably should have. As we got going, we saw that the smut grass and the feed that we put out had far surpassed what my goal was to move them into a body condition score of 5. We had a lot of 6s. Even some of the girls were fat. They were. I was afraid they'd gotten too fat. I had a couple of 7s, and I felt really good about what we'd done. But we then decided, okay, it's time in late December to get the bulls out. We use a 90-day bull system. We went with 3 2-year-old half-blood bulls. We felt like with the composition of the cows that were in the pasture and those young bulls, that we felt like they would be something that might make some keeper heifers for us. But as you can see there, in the background, in through December, we have a lot of dead biomass. And the outside of those clumps turn brown quickly. So when you get kind of a big view of the pasture, if I were to stand and take a picture like this out at the pasture, it looked really brown. But when you would get in to the center of those clumps where the animals were eating, there was still a lot of green material that they were continuing to eat. So long story short, we had half-blood bulls in for 90 days. The cattle foreman in Brighton, his name's Bobby Yates, he said he wanted to put 3 bulls in based on 2 of them were going to fight and 1 of them was going to do business. And he was pretty close to the truth. That in those young bulls, there were 2 of them constantly fighting, and there was one that the one I had a picture of, he had a libido. He was the kind of animal that you wanted in there, and he gave me good service. Those bulls did get fed for their first 30 days in the pasture. After 60 days, I saw that the bulls had pulled away, and I mean, a 5-acre paddock isn't much for 43 animals to be in. But 60 days through, my bulls were off by themselves, and I was feeling like, man, I'm great 60 days in. 14 days later, all 3 bulls were right back in the herd, and I don't know what the story was, but I feel like it was something to denote for folks, because that's for 2 weeks they weren't in the cows at all, and then the final 2 weeks they were there, they were right on top of them, and that made me real nervous. But I'll get to that. This spring, this was actually, I'll just be honest, since I'm up here talking and you have to listen to me. This is not much of a cow, but she was my favorite cow. She's number 31. The other cows beat on her, pushed her away from the molasses. When I put out field cubes, she would run an end around. She'd get to the end and eat her way back. And there was something about her that I said, she's either going to get her head cut off at Preg Check, or she's going to be the best brood cow that ever was. And so this cow, me and her became friends. But you'll see over the last year, this picture was taken just a couple weeks ago. I'll talk just a little bit. We've had Bahia encroach back into my smut grass. I think there's going to be some real good and real bad things about that. but it's not one of the things that I had set this study up to monitor in the beginning. I looked at only what can smutgrass do and what can our stocking rates be on smutgrass pasture. We have seen influx of Bahia, but we also had a lot after the winter. We had a lot of dead material, so I went ahead and I got it was mowed. All my paddocks were mowed the same day that we rotated them off. So I was very fortunate to have a mower out there that came in, and the day we moved them, they would get mowed. I had a problem. Our big problems weren't the broadleaf weeds like dollarweed and matchstem. The cattle were cleaning those up. My problems were thistle, soda apple, and pigweed. They were not being consumed at all, and it was one of the things that there were a couple of my paddocks that had I would consider a very serious thistle problem. I had a lot of thistles. So as we moved that, it did a couple of things. It got rid of the non-consumed weeds, and then it just knocked down the thatch material that was on the outside clumps of my smutgrass. There you'll see just what was very standard throughout the year. Again, the cattle have definitely favored the green, soft growth. Those 40 head haven't been able to keep up. So over the time, we watched as that thatch would build up. We'd have green clumps here, and on the outside, that thatch would get a little thicker and a little thicker and a little thicker. So we don't quite know what the stocking capacity could be. We've talked about maybe this year putting out a barbed wire, or not a barbed wire, but an electric fence to take little pieces of the property or the paddocks away from them. But we're just not sure of where that's going to go yet. And I also don't want to make it so small that I make my fly load even worse. So in the end, here on Monday of this week, this is where I felt like the rubber was really going to meet the road. I brought 40 head to the marsh pens in Brighton. Earlier you heard me say that it consisted of 39 head. I actually had a jumper that had gotten in with me, and so he hasn't gotten my bill yet for getting his cow bred, but I had 40 head that came with me. 39 were Pasture X heifers, and one stray went in. 37 of them were confirmed bred by Doc Liz Steele. She preg checked, she palpated every single one of those for me. One of my best looking heifers that had a little ear to her and was a brindle heifer, she was confirmed with OFD, and if you're not familiar with that, I'm guessing looking out at this crowd, you've all had to talk about OFD. She was confirmed OFD positive on both sides. That was done with ultrasound, and then she could see the fluid on both sides. And then my favorite heifer, number 31, and her and another one, she said they had immature tracks. And so I was pretty disappointed by that, but they were late-born heifers. And she said she felt like there's something wrong with them, that their reproductive tracts had not fully developed. Basically, then she said, well, by some people's math, Aaron, you'd have 100% conception because they would only count after the thing. And I said, well, no, we don't do that. So that put my conception percentage right at 93%. And I was pretty tickled by that, I'll be honest. That put me slightly higher than the pasture around me, as well as my cows were still in a body condition score on average of 6. And I'm a half point to a full point higher than the heifers that surround me. So that made me very, very happy with that. Some of the things that we've seen that I've already mentioned, and I apologize, the pictures of this did not turn out well, but I will say at this point, if anybody ever wants to come to Brighton to see Pasture X, while I'm there, I've brought a few folks out already. I'm happy to, it's not much to see, it's 20 acres. But if somebody wanted to say, I want to pull in there and see what you're doing, we have Bahia grass that's creeping back in. And I never thought I would say that what I'm afraid of is that I'm going to get too much Bahia grass in there, and I'm going to have to start kicking cows out because I don't have the total volume of forage material that Smutgrass has been able to provide. Heath Crum noticed the other day as we were out and we moved the set, he was down and he's looking at the ground, and I thought he was a little crazy at first. And he said, look at this. And I thought he was looking at manure or something. And what he found is that there were very short stem Bahia Bahia had gone to seed. And at this point right now, after we've mowed, I can tell you that as I move cows off of a paddock, I have a tremendous amount of Bahia seed and common Bermuda seed out there. And we've really seen a lot of ground going back to common Bermuda and Bahia. I think that's based on heavy foot traffic of those cattle, as well as they've learned to eat that smut grass, all the things, and they're eating the Bahia and the common Bermuda beside it. But I think they're getting more volume and their bites are directed towards that smut grass. So one of the things that I know that I've got to do this year on that, my goal is to keep these same cattle there for at least 2 years to see what happens carrying them. I need to go out very quickly and measure some spots and take some measurements on how much ground is actually covered by smut grass, how much ground is covered by Bahia and Bermuda, and then be able to report some of the changes that are made. Again, that we can see it visually, but I have no quantitative data that can say we've seen clump size diminish by this much, we've seen Bahia encroach back on this much. We just know it's happening, and that's going to be the next step of this. The other concerns I have, we have seen chinch bugs that are eating smut grass, and we, right there, Heath Crum and an entomologist and Dr. Sellers are looking at those chinch bugs. And I had a meeting with an entomologist actually yesterday, and she said she believes that they are the exact same chinch bugs that we have that eat St. Augustine grass. We were able to find them a couple years ago in one of the big cypress pastures, and they were actually going out and eating smut grass. So I've talked a lot. I think I've covered a lot of ground, but that's all I have. So if anybody has any questions for me or Lindsay, I think now would be a good time for me to be quiet and listen to y'all.
Fertilizer program on this project. How much fertilizer when?
Yes, sir. 50 pounds of nitrogen. 50 pounds of nitrogen, that'll go out as a 20-0-10, and that'll be going out as spring. And that's a good point that wasn't in there, that my fertilizer cost wasn't in there, but we're at 50 pounds of nitrogen.
One time in the spring.
One time in the spring. And I do that not because I love spring fertilization in the rainy season, but I want this to be similar to what the management practices are all around that. So to actually measure any differences between what we're doing on the competitive rotational grazing side, I don't want it to be fertilizer differences that make the difference.
Going forward, Aaron, on the Bahia grass equipment and Bermuda grass equipment, it'd be interesting to see the TDN and crude protein values of those in comparison with your smut grass, just to see if maybe you might be wrong on being able to support those cows on that pattern, on a high intensity.
And well, I'm not wrong. No, I'm kidding. So there's a couple of things that I on a nutritional standpoint, I completely agree with you that those could be their crude proteins and their TDNs could be. I think they're probably right comparable to that smut grass. What I think they're going to fail to do is provide the tonnage, the volume of grass, and so I really don't think that smut grass is a better forage quality product than Bahia. It's better than some of our grasses that are out there, and I don't want to offend any grass breeders, but I think it can be a fine quality forage if it's managed properly, and so the things that cause it problems as a weed can be used as our benefit if we change our management practices, and that's really what that is that our management practices as far as rotation, as far as looking at not only what they're standing on. So when I'm getting ready to rotate, I need to be looking at is there any goodie left in the pasture, but what's happening at 21-day-old growth or 20-day-old growth out in front of me? Am I about to set seed and get rank? And so I think that's the other important management aspect, is that when you're using a heavily competitive and rotational system, you need to be looking at out in front of you as much as you are at what they're standing on. Because once this stuff gets away from us, once it gets back to that very first picture of that uber brown smut grass, it's gone. That if it gets to the point where they're that, If it gets to that, a cow can't eat it. So we've got to just keep going. But I think you're right. I will start pulling some of those samples and seeing nutritionally what's right beside it. Yes, sir.
I'm trying to figure out what the grass was that you were dealing with the smutgrass. And I had that leaf down there for 13 years, it was 90% monster grass. Was that a monster grass pasture or?
You talking about the Mississippi land? This is up in the big factors on the Seminole Tribe land.
I thought you said Mississippi.
No.
The board cattle, when they lost that lease, moved some heifers up into the Seminole Tribe, and so it's right behind the rodeo ring where that board, it's called the board factor. You're right.
Yes.
Down there.
Thank you, Heath Crown. Yes, sir.
I believe you said you had liquid feed there the whole time?
Yes, sir.
What percent?
It changed that we followed the through the winter. What was it, Heath? 24.
It goes for 32 in the winter, down to 24 with 5% fat. Then once we're in the spring, the fertilizer goes out, it goes down to like 8%, just a grass mate mineral through the summer, and then it'll pick back up to a 32 and into a 24.
And that, I'm sure played a big part in how they would eat.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And that was one of those things. I never let them run out of that. You know, I'm a believer in supplementation. You know, and I know that it's going to cost you some, but I do believe it's always my belief is it's a good return on. There's a good return on investment. So I did my due diligence to make sure those tubs never went dry. And again, I know that takes some management, but that was one of the things that I heard earlier, that the management techniques on this do require more time. I think that there are benefits to be had on that. There's some studies coming out on calf loss. I think that human interaction in the pasture is going to show that there's less depredation loss. It also certainly makes, when I pull out to my pasture now, those cows hear my truck, hear the diesel motor from half a mile away. I thought a foreman was messing with me in Brighton one day. He said, "Hey, all your cows are out by the road." And I said, "Oh, yeah, right." And I thought, well, the joke's on him. I already, you know, I'm headed that direction. And it was right at the end of my cubes. And I pulled out there, and all my heifers were out of pasture X. I took one bag of pellets. I dumped a little, went 100 yards, dumped a little further, kept talking to me, and they followed right through. And so now, when it's time to rotate now, they're beating me to the gate. You know, I get out, open the gate, and they're through in 30 seconds. And, you know, then I check my molasses and check my water tubs. And it really, as a condition, my labor has become less and less as we've got this established. Yes, sir.
Have you considered teaching the cows to eat thistle?
Yes, sir. We have, and we looked at that. One of our things is I've read a lot of research on that, and one of the footnotes that's always at the bottom of it is this wasn't effective for control of thistle. You know, so they will actually eat it, but they're going to. It won't. I don't think it provides ultimate control of the thistle, but we've seen a lot of that. We've talked about it, and it's something that we've talked about but not done. Yes, sir.
What do you think about the stocking rate? Do you get the competitive benefits at 1 head per acre, or could you go up to 3?
That's a great question. I think at 1 head an acre, I think they're still going to self-select. They're going to come back to that fresh growth. I think volume-wise, yeah, I think there's going to be more grass for them. I think during the summer months, I think we're limited on capacity only by our winter side time. You know, in the summer we can grow an abundance for forage. You know, and I think that in the summer months, could you go to 3? Yeah, I believe I could. In the winter months, man, this year I was rotating a little faster than every 7 days. I felt like I was, you know, borrowing from Peter to pay Paul each time I would move those cattle this winter, and I was praying for rain and just thinking, oh man, the shoe's going to drop. You know, here, what are we going to do? And so we were able to carry that. If I had 3 per acre, I think I would have definitely seen a reduction in body score through the winter. And so I think I could do it in the summer. I just would be real worried about our limiting seasons, which, you know, I look to be drought conditions or winter. And that's, and again, I was on the razor's edge of feeling like there wasn't much for them to eat through the last part of this winter.
Looking at your pictures in the winter, you still had some brown clumps. You feel like you could have went in there with a mower or grass up?
I think so, Heath. I do. I think one of the other things that I wanted to do with this is, as long as we weren't dropping body condition score, I wanted to keep this as low input. I wanted to say, this is a poor man. This is if Aaron Stam was going to go find 40 acres to lease. You know, how could we do this with the least amount of inputs put in there? But I think if I would have gone in and mowed this winter, I probably could have freshened up some of that grass and seen better growth. And that might be something that I'll look at next year, especially if we really get to the point where we see body conditions start to fall off. But as long as we were maintaining, we did see the molasses consumption increase through the winter, which was expected. But yeah, if we saw body conditions falling off, I think we would have tried any tool we could. Yes, sir.
Why did you shorten the recovery period between grazing during the winter instead of lengthen it?
Because I was out of grass.
Well, you were going to be out of grass anyway.
So, like I said, it's robbing Peter to pay Paul.
So why didn't you feed them a little bit more to stay in that pasture and use some of that old stuff that they were ignoring instead of moving and using the new stuff before it was ready?
So one of the things that we did that we noticed is that, and I think there's 6 one hand, half dozen the other. I don't think you're wrong. I think you're probably right. They could have stayed. They were having to eat some of that old forage as they went around. And so that was, when I say we shortened, I've got one paddock that isn't 5 acres. It's got 2 acres of woods, probably, or 1.5 acres. And so there were just times that even in the growing season that each paddock responds a little bit differently. Some now has more smutgrass and Bahia. And so, I think from a management standpoint, I just had to come out and say, man, there isn't much left in this paddock right now. I've got some stuff looking like it could go to seed over here. And so it was as much at looking at what was in front of them as what they were standing on as well. And so, there were times but usually we were, if I shortened things up, the least amount of rest that things were getting was, 16, 17 days. It wasn't like I had changed back, to a week on, week off kind of system. Yes, sir.
So next spring, they're going to have calves by their side. Are you going to increase their supplementation rate because they increase the calf, or are you going to keep it the same? Or will you increase the rate?
That's a great question, and I'm hoping to keep it near the same, but it's going to be a matter if they start shedding teeth and falling off, we're going to have to do something, and so that's the other part of this is I don't want. They're not my cows, and they belong to Seminole Tribe of Florida's board of directors. They've made an investment in this, so if they start to fall off, yes, we'll say we've got to take steps that we know what we can't do on the smutgrass. So yeah, I'd have no problem with increasing supplementation if we thought those animals were falling off.
I challenge you possibly to replicate the same deal with a possible 5- to 6-year-old cow. Red cows, get out of that feeder line, shed and teeth and all that's out of there. Put more commercial aspect into it on an everyday program. Just for a thought, maybe kind of back on that.
Yeah, and that was one of my, in saying I wanted to carry this on for at least a couple of years, and I get what you're saying with a mature cow versus something still developing, but I like it. We can definitely.
I think you said it at the beginning, but I just want to make sure I understand. If you're dealing with 80 to 100% smutgrass on this test, but if you were working with a pasture that say was only 30 or 40% smutgrass, wouldn't that drive them to overgraze the other, possibly kill the other, and still not have enough forage? So would this work?
Sure.
This kind of system work?
Well, and I think that really becomes where there's that threshold, that 30 to 40% infestation of smutgrass. That still might be a weed, that it might be worth saying that you've got to treat that smutgrass and get rid of it, because you're going to start seeing those problems of what Jose talked about earlier, that it's going to start shading out your Bahia. And so, I think that you might fall into that category that says you're gonna treat it like a weed at that point. Whereas I didn't have a choice when I started. It was the only forage for a lot of the pastures I had. And so I think, does that answer your question, or?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
I've got a couple of questions. One is, I'm a pencil pusher. Now, bottom line, I think for this, what you're doing, you've got to incorporate the mowing. Every day you go out there checking water, every day you go out there moving them. I mean, you got a lot more costs there than what you're showing. And then another thing is heifers. We pretty much all feed our heifers, but I'd like you to see you put a 5-year-old cow out there. Don't give her all that feed. Just give her your supplements, your molasses, see what happens. I mean, when you give it 10 pounds of feed a day, that's pretty much maintaining the cow.
Yes, sir.
And so I'd like to see what would happen if you didn't put the feed out there, just put mineral and molasses and, like most ranchers use, see what happens.
Yes, sir. I agree with you. I think on the costs of my labor, there probably are some inherent costs that aren't shown. And I definitely needed to, on my other, include the cost of mowing, because, I do have 20 acres and it's a minimal cost, but if we were to go through all of that, there's definitely some costs associated. And what I really wanted to show is what I'd spent on developing those heifers, what that supplementation had been. But definitely there's labor costs associated with that. And probably on 40 head, you wouldn't spend that kind of time, but I think something like this is replicable on a larger scale so that the cost per hour and those labor charges wouldn't be as intense as what it would be for my time on only 40 head. But I agree. I think, again, when we started this, we weren't exactly sure where it was going to go. If we were going to say, holy cow, all that research we did on the smutgrass was good numbers, but it can't really carry these cows. And so it's just developing into this of saying, what do we do next? And I completely agree with y'all on starting to put some commercial cows on it and maybe move away from the heifer side. Yes, sir.
I may have missed it, but they were on that feed for how many, they were on it for what, 60 days, 90 days?
90 days.
How long were they
I
on
don't
the pasture?
think that.
How long were they on the pasture? The record you're showing.
I'm sorry?
How long were the heifers on the pasture totally? The record you're showing.
How long, they moved there in August and they're there still. So last August they moved they were there about a month before the hurricane.
Now, did they have molasses all that time or just during the 90 days?
No, sir. They've had molasses through the entire process. The molasses have always been there. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So do you think that smutgrass is going to produce 30,000 to 40,000 pounds per acre of dry matter a year? That's what it's going to take to carry 2 head per acre, isn't it?
I haven't done that math, so you might be.
10,000 pounds per head per year.
But-
Demand is 20,000 pounds. 50% harvest efficiency, you'd have another 20,000 pounds out
So-
there.
So maybe. I mean, I can't give you a yes or a no on that. I'm probably the wrong guy to give you that quantitative data, but possibly. I mean, but based on what I'm seeing, again, I would say the way that we're seeing Bermuda and Bahia come back, my guess would be that we're going to continue to decrease the amount of smutgrass that's there and increase those other species. So that could change the volume of grass, the tonnage.
Or all those heifers have 3/4 blood brown.
Yeah, not all of them. There were some that are commercial Brangus, 3/8, 5/8. So some of them were a little bit more English than what I would have liked, but our bulls were true half bloods. But there was a good mix, I would say, of.
No difference in your scores, conditions, or anything else. You felt
Pretty consistent. I mean, that little 31 that I liked, she was fine bone. She was a little bit more English, and she had an immature track. But no, across the board, we were seeing pretty consistent scores. There were some that got fat and some poor doers, but we felt like there wasn't any anomaly between phenotypes that we could see out there.
Let's thank Aaron, give him a break.